Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my series into theories of ethnicity and nationalism. This is section 2.3 of the lecture series. The page is page 29. If you want to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download it and use it to supplement your learning. So with that, let's begin. Page 29, section 2.3. Okay, so we're going to talk in this section about ethnosymbolism. So ethnosymbolism, we talked about the three of the main nationalist theories that we talked about were primordialism, modernism, and now ethnosymbolism. So let's begin with that discussion, ethnosymbolism. Okay, so number one, it emerges from the theoretical critique of modernism, right? It emerges from the theoretical critique of modernism. Some of the key aspects that we saw in modernism were the fact that it's situated within sort of this revolutionary period in global history, modernism that is. It evolves out of, if you will, the spirit of revolution. And one of the key aspects that we talked about was the manner in which the modernist theory, the modernist nation state, evolves as a product of our social interaction, right? Again, what I'm doing in this series is not to talk about sort of the obvious sort of discourses on modernist primordialist theories. You can go to Wikipedia and look at that stuff, and you can read any sort of layperson's textbook. And this is it's designed to be graduate level course, albeit introductory, and it's to supplement existing information. So my approach is always to give a little bit more information or a different spin or a different interpretation on existing information, stuff that you're not going to be able to readily find or find at all on the internet. Use that information, the information that we're discussing now, in addition to the information that you already have, and you have even more content knowledge. Ethnosymbolism, it's not that ethnosymbolism and nationalism, modernism are incompatible. It's not to say that, right? The author says emerges from the critique of it. It's to say that, and as we'll see, the emphasis of an ethnosymbolic nationalism, the emphasis that's placed on ethnical populations on the one hand, and this symbolic, sort of the influence of symbols, and the influence of, and the power of symbolic discourse and symbolic use, creates a new paradigm, creates something different that can be added in the addendum with, that can be added to our existing understanding of modernism. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that ethnosymbolism and modernism are incompatible, and I wouldn't say that the author is saying that. It's that it emerges, ethnosymbolism emerges from the theoretical critique of modernism. Number two, ethnosymbolism argues that the rise of the nation needs to be contextualized within a larger phenomenon of ethnicity which shaped them, right? We need to recognize and contextualize that nations and the rise of nationhood, and we talked about this, is itself a product of this collective group biological genetic identification. That the ethnicity is a collective grouping, obviously. That collective grouping has a name. It's the people X. The people X are defined as such in part because of their genetic similarities, their territorial, shared territorial characteristics, and on and on and on. So again, I don't want to, we only have one more section to go before we complete the series. So a lot of this has already been discussed in a significant amount of detail, so I don't want to spend too much time on one or two. Number three, this is a key point. Contemporary nationalism is nothing but the final stage of a larger cycle of ethnic consciousness. Right? So I'm going to talk about that a bit. Ethnic consciousness reaching back to the earliest forms of collective organization. Okay, so when we talk about ethnic symbolism, you have to ask yourself sort of what is C-O-N What is ethnic consciousness, right? So this is a quote from the author. Contemporary nationalism is nothing but the final stage of a larger cycle of ethnic consciousness. Now, there's many ways to interpret. There's no right or wrong way of interpreting what ethnic consciousness is. But if you think about the discourse of class consciousness, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so just briefly, I will assume that you already know what class consciousness is. If you don't, look it up and just get a sort of ancillary understanding of what class consciousness is. But in terms of class consciousness, it is the collective recognition within a class, say the middle class, the proletariat, that they are in an oppressive, subjective relationship with systemic power. And collectively, this recognition, and this is sort of the super consolidated version of it, the collective recognition of this brings about a new spirit, a new impetus for social change, a new need. This is sort of Geist, right? It's the spirit of the time, right? This is, I don't know how to explain it simply. It really does require quite a bit of elaboration. But the way to think of it is, imagine you go to a concert, is a good way to explain this, right? Imagine that you're at a concert and the arena is packed, and you have people on the floor, you have people in the stands, and then you have the group in the front. Class consciousness is the realization that everyone in that stadium is there in celebration of some phenomena. That phenomena being the group, being the band. If you think about this in a social sense, it's the realization that we are all collectively here, that is in existence. We are, period. We are as a product of our social interrelationships, and that once we recognize the similarities rather than the distinctions, once we recognize that we are all here for the same end, we are all participating in the same event, if you will, the event now being life, and that all of the disparities in wealth and all of the disparities in education and intellect and physical ability and all the disparities of anything and anything that you can, everything and anything that you can think of, are themselves informed by our social constructs. That ignites, it creates a catalyst with which we bring about a new social revolution. So if you think about people like Bob Marley or John Lennon, if you think about people like Martin Luther King and JFK, you think about, now I say that, people who sparked this, tend to end up getting assassinated. Quite a bit. Bob Marley was attempted assassination, MLK was killed, JFK was killed, Lenin was killed. Everybody did what I just said, and I did not prepare this. This is like I'm doing this on the fly based on the notes that had to guide me. But if you think about, yeah, it's funny. It's not funny at all, actually. It's sort of, but that's the thing, right? That there's a tremendous amount of power in, and I think it's to no surprise, just off the top, we got two politicians and two musicians, right? Music is powerful, politics is obviously powerful. But the idea is that class consciousness isn't individuated. It isn't, that's the key element, right? It's not individuated, it's not divisive. It isn't antithetical, it isn't hostile, it isn't a polemic. It's a unified consensus. It's a Geist. It is a force. It's a spirit. It's the realization that this collective organization of human labor, human power, transforms things, and it is a very powerful force. So we have sort of the nice, tidy 5-minute sort of understanding of class consciousness, and of course I'm leaving. I mean, you could do a whole semester on what that is. Ethnical consciousness it has the same sentiment. It is the collective recognition within an ethnical group that we are in this fight together. So for example, somewhere in this notes you can, I don't use, unfortunately, I've never gotten around to using Apple. So Control F is what I do to find stuff, right? I don't know what you do in Apple. So Control F, just type in horizontal violence. It's somewhere in these notes. I discussed it earlier about Freire, and the idea of horizontal violence is intra, not inter. though it can be intra-ethnical violence. So that you have within an ethnic population, division within an ethnic population, let's say black, for B, and you have some segment of a subpopulation at odds with any number of other segments of the same ethnical population, right? So black on black violence, Hispanic on Hispanic violence, white on white violence, black on, it could be inter, but this would be intra, I-N-T-R-A, intra-ethnical conflict, intra-ethnical violence. In terms of ethnical consciousness, it's the recognition that this is sort of crabs in a bucket, right? All in an attempt to strive to the top, you put a whole bunch of crabs to the bucket, and what do? They all try to climb to the top, pulling others down to lift themselves up. But as soon as you make any progress up, the person beneath you pulls you down and tries to bring them up. And what ends up happening? None of the crabs ever escape, right? It's just a repeating cycle of self-imposed oppression. And ethnical consciousness is the recognition that, hey, we are the people who are being oppressed, or we are the people who are disenfranchised from power and representation, or we are the people who are being politically dominated via violence or economically exploited, and right? So we are the people that this spawns a revolution, as was the case post-MLK. I'm in here, in part, doing what I'm doing as a consequence of all of the efforts from the civil rights. That's just a fact. Without those efforts, it's not to say that I wouldn't be here, but it would be more difficult. It would have been another path. I do believe we would have arrived at this point. It's inevitable that we would have arrived at this point, given the concept America. America might begrudgingly relinquish some of that, what is perceived to be control, only to recognize that no, there are no more elements of power in inclusion, not less. The more inclusive you are, the more inclusive you become, the more you expand your power, the more you instill loyalty, the more reverence that you have from potentially speaking, the more reverence you have from your community. Now there's a level of disenfranchisement that's always going to be inherent in political power. In any power, disenfranchisement is part of power, right? There is what power is, and then there's what power is not. I'm not that. I'm not part of this. I'm not that group, and I define myself in terms of who I'm not. I'm more like these guys, and I'm less like you, right? And then we talked about sort of binary opposition in Carl Schmitt's account of friend, enemy, and stuff. It's partly that, right? Power, by definition, can't absorb, can't be completely inclusive, right? Because if everything's powerful, then nothing's powerful. But you get the idea. So ethnical consciousness is precisely that. It is the collective, unified recognition of, it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of subjugation or abject poverty, if you will, but the idea is that collective consciousness within, that class consciousness within, that ethnical consciousness within this ethnical population sparks social transformation. It's the catalyst with which social transformation unfolds. So as long as you understand that, that's like the key element I wanted to make clear. It should be clear now. So now this makes sense, right? Contemporary nationalism is nothing but the final stage. I'm always a little cautious when I hear final stages, but that's fine. But the final stage of a larger cycle of ethnical consciousness, reaching back to the earliest forms of collective organization, right? This is the final, quote-unquote, the final stage. We're approaching a final stage. I don't believe in a final stage, right? I think it's, especially when we're talking about the global order. There might be final stages in terms of functions and systems, of course. In terms of a global order, that, and you can tell it's Marxist, right? This sentence is clearly a Marxist sentence. We're talking about the final stage. This is via the final collapse and implosion of capital. Ethnical consciousness is kind of like class consciousness, so you can recognize immediately that this sentence, the author, is indebted to a Marxist ideology. Whether the author himself is espousing Marxism is sort of irrelevant. What's at stake here is a recognition that Marx informs this sentence. So all of the problems and all of the complications that arise with Marx's critique on capital inhere within this sentence, right? So, I mean to be technical. So 3A, collective organization is less about identification of shared ethnical characteristics and more about inclusion or exclusion of others based on a lack of shared characteristics, right? So it's less about who we are and more about who they are. And that's precisely the opposite of the ethnical consciousness, right? Ethnical consciousness is more about who we are. And I think that this is a good thing, right? I think it's in moderation with an astute enough population. And that's the problem, right? Your population has to be, they have to be, cognizant of just, the basics. It's really difficult to get any of this. You can't have Geist. You can't have that. You can't have nor zeitgeist. You can't have transformation. You can't have this wave, this sort of social. Think about the wave that you do at the stadium. Each individual person is doing just their part, right? They raise their hand up. When you see it coming to you, it's time for you to put your hand up and contribute to this force. But the truth of the matter is that at an individual level, all that is occurring is one individual person is raising his or her hand. That's all that's happening. It's when you look back beyond the individual that you recognize how that energy, how that force is transferring itself throughout the stadium, right, via the wave. If you refuse to put your hand up, there'll still be a wave. If a lot of people refuse to put their hands up, then it makes the wave that much more complicated. And I would say that the refusal to put your hand in the air and participate in the wave when you're at a social event where the wave is common is to be apathetic, right? Apathy is, I don't really feel like, I'm here to watch the game, I'm not going to put my hand up. That's corny. If enough people think, hey, I'm not going to put my hand up to do the wave, that's corny, you'll never have a wave. You'll have the three groups in the stadium that are desperately trying to get the wave started. And you can see these groups easily. They're readily identifiable. That's the group that's trying to start the wave. Look at them. And, so let's say 50 people in that group. You can imagine a section of a stadium. 50 people in synchronous. Raise their hands up. Yay! Oh, yay! Oh, nobody's going to play. Nobody's going to play along. Well, shout out to the 50 people who throw their hands up in the air. Just keep throwing your hands up in the air. Eventually the sheep will wake up. And if they don't, well, shout out to you for trying to start a wave. You know what I mean? It's about either starting a wave or not being a hater when the wave comes to you and throw your damn hand up in the air. Right? But the idea is people are too cool now. Everybody's cool, right? And it's just not cool to do the wave. That's for kids. This sounds like, Dr. Campbell, what the hell are you talking about? How does that relate to anything in terms of this shared ethnical or shared class or shared collective consciousness, right? The idea is sharing, right? We're sharing in this event. The conditions that would necessitate a wave now, socially speaking, to sort of take it from ghetto philosophy into a little bit something with more substance. This is not to debase ghetto philosophy. Ghetto philosophy is the foundation for understanding anything, right? So let's keep it real. In a contemporary setting, in the States, it's our socioeconomic disparity. In the globe, it might be disparities in, ethnical populations and extermination. It might be genocidal. It could take on any number of forms, right? There's any number of forms that this subjugation of another group might have. In the United States of America, it's economic. And you would think that the current economic climate in the United States, where, quote unquote, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the middle class is getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and also assuming more of the tax burden, because rich have loopholes and the poor don't pay anything. So, it's a huge tax burden for those of us who go to work and pay our bills and, send the checks to Uncle Sam. The idea is, you would think that this current economic climate would create a condition in which people would wake up and be like, hey, I want to participate. Hey, let's start a wave. Hey, let's change something. I want representation. I want to have this done or that done and blah blah blah. But I think people are too cool, right? And thus nothing happens. In the United States of America, in terms of this ethnical identification, though this is a gross generalization, the ethnical populations that are most affected, probably disproportionately so. I don't have statistics yet, or I won't have statistics because I didn't take time to back this up with numbers. This is more of a gut feeling, but I would imagine that it's true. I would imagine that poverty is ethnically identified by minorities. Of course, there's white people who are impoverished. There's no one saying that. I'm not saying that it is. But when I think poverty in the United States, I'm not thinking necessarily a white guy. I mean, I know there's tons and tons of white guys, as evident in Romney's unfortunate statement about the 47%. You know, a lot of white guys and gals who may have voted for Romney found themselves recognizing, hey, this isn't about black and white anymore. This is about having green and not having green. And I don't have green, and he's talking negatively about me. And he's talking negatively about what I stand for, so I'm going to vote for the other guy, irrespective of the fact if the other guy's black or not. Right? So, I mean, I actually believe that that led to some social good. I really do believe that that led to some social good, but that's a side note. I think more to the point, in terms of the ethnical identification and the ethnical need to recognize, it's blacks and Hispanics for the most part. Right? It's blacks and Hispanics, and there's division within both groups. You have affluent blacks, you have sort of hood mentality, ratchet blacks, if you will. Of course, this is a gross generalization. Similarly with Hispanics. But the idea is, in terms of ethnical consciousness is a recognition that, hey, we all got to do our part. So this is me doing my part. Now, granted, I recognize that, you know, there's probably no, I take that back. I had a few high school students in the past few years hit me up on the email and say, hey, Dr. Campbell, I'm in my high school X class, and I watched your video. I forget the specifics, but I've had high school students and sort of undergrads, you know, they email me, undergrads more, all the time saying, hey, I appreciate what you're doing. I'm not doing it for whites, blacks, or anybody. I'm doing this for the globe. But you can recognize I've made it to a certain point in society. I'm not a filthy rich guy. I don't have money to like make huge philanthropic contributions. Though the little bit that I do, I have given away some stuff. My CV attests to that, right? I've given away like 2 or 3 iPads of, you know, any little bit that I do. I built iGuard out of my own pocket. I try to give back, but this, right, these free lectures is how I give back. It's not like I've come here, now forget everybody on the bottom. No, it's like I've come here, I'm going to put this out. Granted, it's boring, it's long, you might not see how this is going to facilitate your education. But, you know, people studying for their exams who need to have a quick brush up on some theoretical paradigm, come watch a video. Hey, Dr. Campbell, you know, I watched your video on theories, I watched your qualitative research video, and it helped me pass my examination. Well, that's what this is all about, right? Bring up a couple of people when you make it to the top, rather than trying to pull some people down when you make it to the top. So that ethnical consciousness is a recognition of this shared obligation that we have to give back. So, I've done videos on this. I think it's called Knowledge 101 or something like that. I did a video on something like this, right? It wasn't in terms of ethnical consciousness, but there needs to be a recognition that the ethnical population collectively, as a mass, not as individual members of an ethnical population, are subjugated and repressed, are suffering, are impoverished, are starving, are disenfranchised, what have you. And then ethnical consciousness is the awakening. It's the recognition, and thus, of course, none of this works if there isn't demands. None of this works if there isn't coordination and mobilization. None of this works if there isn't representation and figureheads leading. If those basics aren't there, none of this works. Right? You're not going to have class ethnical consciousness without a leader. You're not going to have class ethnical consciousness without sort of a list of demands and what you're doing in organization and stuff. Right? If you're just going to sit down and protest for the sake of protesting, none of this is ever going to mean anything. So let's go into the symbolic boundary. Let's go into the symbolic boundaries mechanism. And what I'll do is, in this next section, I'm going to tie in what I just said in terms of primarily ethnical consciousness, with the emphasis on sort of the unity and the unification and the ability to unite, galvanize a population based on that consciousness. So I'm going to preserve that, and we're going to slowly integrate the conception of consciousness into its symbolic representation, right? So, I mean, the obvious, this is the no-brainer obvious example of this would be Shepard Fairey's rendition of the Obama poster, Hope. So you have this sort of canonical image of President Obama. He's sort of looking in the distance. You got like a three-quarter profile view. It's got this cool sort of, you know, red and blue-ish sort of color to it, and you've got hope big right under his face, thereby branding hope to this man, to this person. You can see that the consciousness of the people collectively was imbued by the representation. It was imbued in the representation of the word hope, or the projection. And when I say representation, I mean the actual sort of letters, H-O-P-E, under the image. That sort of, that icon, that image, that symbol, is itself a repository of all of the hopes of, you know, Tina and Tim and Mary and, you know, Kansas and Arkansas and Alaska and Fresno, blah, blah, blah. All of the collective will of the people who were looking for a way out of whatever it is that they're stuck in. It now becomes crystallized, formalized in that symbol. And it was very powerful, right? I mean, Shepard Fairey in his own right was just, he's always been a rebel. Shout out, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm always brutalizing the pronunciation of people's names, so forgive me, that's not how you pronounce his name. But you know the guy who did the the Obey stickers, right? Which is just genius, right? Kind of anti-establishment, and you know you come full cycle when you begin anti-establishment, and then you are, you are completely and wholly co-opted by the establishment, right? It's great. But, you know, for me, I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm sure he does, and I think I've heard him critique to say, you know, he's not so fond of the image. I absolutely adore the image. I think it's genius. But you get the idea, right? The idea is we now have the collective need for hope in a better tomorrow manifest itself, materialize itself in that symbol, which is actually bigger than the actual physical person, Barack Obama. Like, there's Barack Obama, the man, who in his own right, as a man, is pretty intimidating, not sort of physically or aggressively, but intellectually. And then you have what has transcended President Obama, which is that image. Like, that image captures who he is. And it captures the spirit of America at that time. So, and I'm not doing partisan politics here. It's not, I'm not saying that it's good or bad or what have you. The idea is, clearly it worked. Clearly it was effective because of the quantifiable distinctions in terms of victory in both elections. The second being a complete landslide, right? So it's very powerful. It still resonates. That image still has power. It's still sort of, I mean, I'm using it now. I'm using it now as an example to make sense of ethnosymbolism, right? Though it wasn't really ethnic, but you get the idea of the symbology. So this is going to be Armstrong's symbolic boundary mechanism, right? I don't actually want to, yeah, I see I put brief here. I don't want to spend too much time on this, right? So let's look at two distinct sort of flowcharts. The culmination of one half at the very bottom is going to end in Middle Eastern identification, generally, right? This is Arabic, Islamic, Middle Eastern. I recognize their demarcations and the three aren't the same. I recognize that. But this isn't really, I've synthesized this flowchart, but the content and the theoretical justification from this comes up, obviously, from Armstrong's discourse on symbolic boundaries. So I'm just going to go really briefly through this. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this. I may or may not choose to write on this at some point in the future. But the idea is, how do we come about this representation geographically? So we have myths and symbols, right? We have myths and symbols, and the myth and symbol between Europe, so we're going to culminate with Europe on the one hand, and we're going to culminate with the Middle East on the other. They both have myths, they both have symbols, but the argument, according to Armstrong, is that the Middle Eastern identification begins with a nomadic, sort of agrarian standard of life, right? An agrarian, a nomadic agrarian a nomadic way of life, right? You sort of move from one spot to another spot seasonally, and caravans and such. You get the idea, right? And I talked about this sort of ethno-territoriality and this ethno-territorial distinction in terms of conflict, how it arises between, this is exactly what I discussed. I didn't, I remembered that I had written this, but I didn't think I would revisit this in terms of symbolism now. And then we have Europe as being sedentary. This, both of these evolve into national identification, right? And I'm not going to write the whole thing down, right, because it's here. Both of these evolve, right? The nomadic way of life transforms into a national identification that is itself built on, remember, ethno-territoriality itself informs national identification. Ethno-territoriality informs national identification. So we have a national identification now, a national identity now, that is contingent, is dependent on a nomadic way of life. That leads to, as Armstrong says, genealogical principles. Right? This evolves into genealogical rather than territorial. This is a really important part, right? This sort of line is important, right? This line is a very important line. Why? Because in terms of the nomadic way of life, if you think about this, right, and this is a bit of a narrative that Armstrong is giving. I think it's a very powerful narrative. It's very subtle, and you could back this up rather easily in terms of just just cursory historical analysis. You have, and you don't necessarily have to go through the discussion on the Prophet Muhammad per se, but obviously he's implying this. Armstrong is making this implication. The idea is the identification of the nation is a consequence of the impact and the importance and the reverence that the Prophet had. The Prophet had, and I understand that some Christians will think that this is ludicrous and such, and that's not the point here. It's not about what you think per se, as much as it is what Middle Easterns believe, right? They believe, whether justly or not, that the Prophet Muhammad was the final prophet of God. And as such, what becomes very important first is the conditions that led to him recognizing and actualizing his objective in the world, which was spreading the word. Which was that, right? Which was that. But prior to him, this sort of caravan nomadic culture had existed already for years. And that manifested itself in the formalization and the influences that culminate really in this contemporary genealogical discourse, that individuals are descendants from him, from the Prophet. Right? And there's any number of debates, and I'm not going to go into the distinction between Sunni and Shia genealogically, that sort of reify the conflict, sort of intra-Islamic conflict. But the distinctions and a lot of the conflict in the Middle East, whether justly or not, is a consequence of those who claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad. So you can see genealogically how affiliation to the Prophet is something that is revered, right? Why wouldn't you want to say that I am of the bloodline of the Prophet himself? I mean, that's a huge call to not just power, because I don't know much about Islamic faith and tradition. I am a bit sort of curious, but you can imagine it's more than just power. It's an obligation, right? It's an obligation from the divine, right? You have direct genealogical lineage to the last prophet that God sent, and thus you have the obligation, the moral, the religious obligation to spread the word, to do whatever it is that you are called to do, right? So you can see that the entire identity then, to sort of crystallize all of this then, of Middle East, embodies a lot of this. Now granted, it's unfair to those who live in the Middle East that don't espouse Islamic belief. But I mean, let's be fair here. I mean, when we talk about Christianity, we think about the West. When we talk about the Middle East, we think about Islam. So whether you think it's just or not, my attempt is to explain Armstrong's sort of descriptive account, and it's legitimate. It's clearly legitimate. And I think it is charitable to the Islamic culture. It properly articulates the importance of genealogy. Why? Because it's not just that I am literally of the blood of Muhammad, and as such, I'm in power. Here I am to control. No, it's I'm literally of the genealogical descent from Muhammad, and as the last prophet of God, he had an obligation, he had a mission, he had a divine mission. It's almost like divine right. And similarly, that divine obligation is my obligation as well. Thus, that concept, that argument, that the way in which that is articulated crystallizes itself. It localizes itself in the collective practices in the Middle East, and thus we have Middle Eastern identification. And that becomes the symbol, right? The symbol is a lot more complicated than that, but that's sort of the neat and tidy. In Europe, it's a completely different narrative, right? In Europe, the narrative begins with the recognition of ownership of land, and the immediate correlation between ownership of land and the quantity of ownership, the amount of land that was owned, and affluence and wealth. So in a foregone error, the more land you owned, the more wealthy you were. There was a direct correlation between ownership and wealth, and thus the drive was for more and more acquisition, more and more ownership, more and more land. So you had enormous swaths of land that would be owned by individual families, and those families obviously were as powerful as they can come. Now, this informs national identification, and you can see why this sedentary sort of agrarian life mode of being in the world influenced territorial acquisition. And if there is anything that informs, and this, I should be fair, because I was very charitable to Islamic belief. Unfortunately, let me think, territorial, a good example. Yeah, I can't think of anything but bad examples, which is bizarre if you think about it, right? The belief that territorial ownership and territorial sort of conquest is the way of national identification. It is sort of the goal. I mean, it obviously informed both colonialism, which was a huge tragedy globally, and Adolf Hitler's Lebensraum, right? Living space. The fact that we need more land, more space. I'm trying to think of a good, I can't, and this is just a limitation of my historical knowledge. Those are the two key, these are two key phenomena that arise, right? And that territorial expansion leads to, that is sort of Europe. Even before that, Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great. The idea of territorial expansion, that's been a European, that's what, sort of historically speaking, Europe was founded on. More and more acquisition of land. And once acquisition of land has reached the shore, then it's time to build ships and look for more land. Now that we've globalized and occupied the globe, there is no more land to be claimed. The world has been claimed. This conquest is done. This conquest is done. But surprisingly and interestingly enough, this conquest is not. Right? First of all, I wouldn't say it's even, I guess now to sort of critique this as well, to be fair, it could be looked at as conquest, right? You could see how the genealogical descent from the Prophet Muhammad could be abused, not in terms of accepting moral religious obligation, but abused and used as a means of gaining more power, right? Which would mean it would be exactly the same as this. This is clearly defined by power. There is no consideration for really others in this other than those who are in the business of acquiring ownership. So one thing I might say, now that I think about it, in critique of this symbolic boundary, is that the articulation of it might undermine European identification, European, sort of the symbol of European identity as being associated with sort of land, really negatively, whereas the genealogical descent and the argument for kinsmanship to the Prophet Muhammad, while it has negative implications, it really could be used to do, it could be used to do good, to be charitable. It's difficult to see how you could operationalize this other than something in the United States. Even in the United States, you know, and I'm a bit off tangent here, but you know, Americans are, I mean, America descended from, there's descent from, both descent in both contexts, right, both connotative and denotatively, from Europe. But, you know, there's a lot of European ideals still built in America. I'll talk more and more about this in rather complex detail when I get into my race theory, right? So almost like European envy, if you will. I think a lot of that is dissipated and faded. But in part of the, you know, it's funny if you even make that application. That's really interesting. Like, I'm on a bit of a, it's not really a tangent though. You can really make that application again to show why there's a problem here. So, quick tangent. I had no idea that it was going to take me here, but I'm here now, so I have to discuss it. I don't, you know, notes, spawn, collected brain stuff, and just sort of give it. So once it's there, I got to say it. Otherwise, it's choppy, and I'm doing this. So, and prior to the market collapse in 07, 08, you know, you have this idea, I'll give conservatives this, I'll grant conservatives this. You have this idea that everybody should own a home. And I recognize that that itself is a generalization, and all the liberals are going to be upset because I said that. But, you know, I'm wedded to reason, I'm not wedded to a party. The idea is everybody should own a home in the United States, irrespective of your level of impoverishment, irrespective of your level or lack thereof of responsibility and financial awareness. Everybody should own a home. And, you know, it's home ownership for everybody. And so that's the drive. And it sounds good, and it's a good cause, and, you know, it's just and such. So everybody should own, right? And we're talking about land, right? Everybody should have their little piece of land, if you will. Same sort of, it's funny how, you know, this is funny. It's almost Nietzschean. On a quick tangent, Nietzsche was, and maybe it's Nietzsche now influencing me because I've read a lot of Nietzsche. I've read basically all of Nietzsche. But in terms of Nietzsche's discourse, what he's notorious for doing is to find remnants of Christian influence in things that profess not to be Christian. Oh, you say you're not Christian, you think that your paradigms aren't Christian influence, but look, here's a deconstruction, not in the Derridean sense, but here's a dismantlement, here's a itemization of your theories, of your practices, and here's how it has been informed by Christianity. So you think it's not informed by Christianity, but you're still Christian. It's still very much Christian. Similarly, I think America believes, and Americans believe, we have finally divorced ourselves from Europe and European ideals. However, there's still such an impactful, almost nostalgic reverence for, you know, the old guard, the old guard, right? It's a very old guard. And the idea is, this idea of ownership still influences American policy. It might seem like it's a stretch to make this argument, but it's surprising how symbolically it still adheres, right? If you think even more impactfully about the idea of the American dream, which is clearly symbolic, we recognize that it has allegiance, that idea has allegiance to a European ideal. So what ends up happening, everybody tries to get a house, people don't have good jobs so they can get subprime this and that, blah, blah, blah. Everybody's working, playing the game, getting stuff, flipping properties, making money, using their equity, da, da, da. Everybody does it. Everybody jumps in the bandwagon, jumps in, and then what happens? Pow! Implosion. Everything collapses. Now, I absolutely believe we'll build ourselves back. What I heard last night is the feds are making moves because I guess there's a certain amount of market growth. The feds are making moves to allow the market to resume control over the market, individual home ownership and such. And it is a goal. It's a goal for me. It's been a goal. It will continue to be a goal. I think it's a great goal to have. But the idea is to demonstrate how that goal could potentially be corrupted, but more importantly, how that goal has it's a symbological, right? It's indebted to a European way of life, and this is clearly this idea, this sentiment predates America. It predates most of the nations in Europe. It's part of Alexander the Great's conquest, and thus it's Aristotelian, and thus we can eventually take it back to Plato. All of contemporary philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, and it is really, really true. Now, I'm not going to go into the Platonic discourse. That's way too tangential. But you can create a single line of historical argumentation connecting aspects of Plato and obviously Aristotle to the 2007 U.S. market collapse, 2007-2008 market collapse, and that's it's pretty freaking interesting if you think about it. I think the awareness of this now changes the nature of the game. Why? Okay, we recognize what we can operationalize and what we can't. We recognize old associations still informing us. Let's create new symbols, or let's readapt the old ones, right? I'm not going to get into that at all. So number one, at the bottom of page 29, just very briefly, the role of myth on the persistence on ethnical identity. And this is obvious, right? You have persistent ethnical identity. The funny thing is, this image comes into my mind. I know why it came into my mind, but I'm not going to put sort of the, my personal context why this jumped in my mind, but it works perfectly. Techno-Viking, right? If you Google Techno-Viking, right, or you put it in Yahoo, and you type in Techno-Viking and watch the Techno-Viking, you see this enormous white guy, and he's dancing to techno music in the middle of the streets, and he just looks really mad as hell. But he's in his zone, and he's doing his Nordic dance, and he's that guy. So you watch Techno-Viking, and you're thinking, wow, it's just such a powerful symbol. Like, it is symbolic. It is tremendously symbolic. It's an insane video. It probably has 50 million hits by now. I had seen it a few years ago, and it was hilarious. But more than being hilarious, you just see this guy completely, he's in his zone. Now, how does that relate? There's a myth, right? Techno-Vikings become quite, I can't believe I'm doing techno, but I did a shout out to Chief Keef, so if we're going to do a shout out to Chief Keef, you got to do a shout out to Techno-Viking. Techno-Viking is symbolic. He's part the old guard, he's the Viking, but he's part the new guard, he's techno. He's both. Techno-Viking. Oh, this is what happens when you spend too much time by yourself, right? You entertain yourself. But it's genius. It really is genius. It really is. Techno-Viking, he's the bridge, right? And I know this comes across like I'm being facetious, and I'm so not. It's brilliant. It's brilliant what sort of Techno-Viking represents. Now, it would be tragic to go check the guy out now and see him in a mundane daily life doing his regular job and what he's doing. That would completely destroy the symbolism. Techno-Viking will only ever be Techno-Viking in that video, right? It's that specific video. Big, Nordic, white, muscular, angry, Viking, dancing uncontrollably to the most electronic music ever. Both worlds collapsing in one physical body. The best of the old world with the best of the new world in a body symbolized, right? In terms of Middle Eastern, the same thing. The best of the old world, the best of the new world, contained in a body symbolized, right? Barack Obama, exactly the same thing. The best of the, biologically, he's black and white. I don't know what he considers himself in terms of race. That's its own. People in my family, Jamaicans, are all mixed. But the idea is he's both black and white. That's funny. He's both black and white. He is, as a person, he's part of the new era. The guy raised damn near $1 billion on a cell phone. Cell phone contributions. I mean, that's freaking genius. If that's not New Age, I don't know what New Age is. But it's the old traditional meet and greet, shake your hands politician. Hi, how are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Take the picture with the baby, smile, go to the events, go to the rallies, go to the freaking town meetings. Old guard stuff. So he does the best of the old guard stuff. He shakes hands and smiles and meets and greets better than anybody else. But he does this New Age stuff better than even rock stars do it. I mean, who raises $1 billion off the phone? That's insane. It's that. It's that. That's the formula. That's the formula. I mean, and I'm giving you, I said brief because, I mean, it's so much deeper than that. But I know when it's good, and that's nothing to compare to how deep the rabbit hole really goes, right? The rabbit hole goes really deep. But the idea is best of the old world, best of the new world, embodied and named. That's kind of like the formula. All right, number 2, 29. Ethnic groups are not, so that's the myth, right? Because Barack Obama is not just that, right? He's a dad, he's a husband, he's a guy who has dreams outside of politics. He wants to blah, blah, blah. Techno-Viking is a regular dude. It was a day. If you were seeing him now, he might not look the same. He might not be as fit. He might, such and such and such. All right, that's why it's mythical. Number 2, ethnical groups are not necessarily based on the occupation of particular exclusive territories. I mean, there's nothing to explain there. That's sort of self-evident. Top of page 30. The mythometer, the myth engine, right? I like this idea, right? And I'm probably not pronouncing this right, but I'll just say mythometer, right? It's a French word, and unfortunately, I did take French and I got an A, but no French. Not yet. It might be a goal for next year. I got to think about that. So the myth engine. I love this. I love this idea. I absolutely adore this idea. The idea that there is an engine, a force, creating narrative, generating perpetually stories. Obviously, Hollywood does this better than anybody, which is why, as far as I'm concerned, you're really not doing it till you go to Hollywood. So that's the ultimate game. But, even in Hollywood, it's not easy. It's not easy. And the legion of people who have left and gone to Los Angeles and gone to California and never made it in the movies will attest to how difficult it is. Right? Oh yeah, you just got to come up with a story and, have something creative, have some cool characters, and then you just pitch it and then, that's it. No. It's an engine. There's function. There has to be a recognition of purpose and meaning. There has to be a recognition of signification. You have to have some semiotics in there. Your characters, and on and on and on and on. I'm not going to break that down, but while this works obviously for revenue generation in Hollywood, you'd better believe that nations use this. It doesn't make the nation money per se. It doesn't hamper it. I mean, it might contribute to it, but what it does is establishes an ideal, right? It establishes a condition for affiliation. Hey, I want to be affiliated with those guys. Those guys are doing it big. That's the group, that's the nation that I want to pledge my allegiance to. I want to go over there. I want to contribute my brain to those guys. Why? Because of some ideal, because of this narrative that you were told. But you better believe it's men and women, regular men and women, well maybe not regular men and women, seemingly regular men and women that are actually writing out the prescription for how this unfolds. Now, granted, it's not like there's a boogeyman somewhere doing all of this work. No, this is part of our narrative. This is part of our history. So when we hear about Paul Revere, what Paul Revere did, when we hear about the Boston Tea Party and the function in terms of dissent, when you hear about David Thoreau, when you hear about any of these, right? When you hear about Twain, when you hear about MLK, they've contributed to this narrative that is America. And they're contributing, I can't forget women, right? Or any number of others. When you hear this narrative of their lives, of what they did, of what they sacrificed, of what they lost, their pains, their trials and tribulations, oh my goodness, I'm so tired of that old cliche. It's like, so I just say it because I wasn't going to say it, but, trials and tribulations is overdone. Let's just talk about tribulations. Let's just talk about trials. Why do we have to talk about trials and tribulations? I have no idea. And so, I have no intent in actually saying it, but it came into my head, so I said it to make a point. But you get the idea, right? In terms of, it had nothing to do with the lecture series. In terms of this myth engine, the myth engine is the manner in which the narrative of the nation creates and informs how people see us, how people see your nation. It's important to make sure that you are in control of the narrative of your nation, because if you're not, someone else will talk about your nation. And they will tell the narrative that is your story. And nobody wants someone from the outside telling others about who I am. I mean, you can think about any family conflict that you have. You want to tell the narrative of your family. You don't want someone else coming into the family and then saying, oh, the Campbells are like this, or oh, the Smiths are like that, the Joneses are like that, the Rodriguezes are like that, and on and on. Right? You want to tell that narrative yourself. So this myth engine is used nationally to preserve the quote-unquote intense consciousness. I told you we would sort of reabsorb this. The intense consciousness of loyalty and identity established through face-to-face contact in the city-state. Myth transference for political purposes. I don't want to go too much into that, but the idea is the narrative that is told so that we can formalize our identity as a nation and instill loyalty to and throughout our citizenry. We want our citizens to be loyal to the nation. So people will tell you, I forget where it was, and I think I did a video, I don't remember the name of the video, in response to a private email that I got. This was years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And, you know, the person was like, what are you, scared? Like you don't want to say any anti-American stuff? What, are you scared to talk about anti-Americanism and blah, blah, blah? And this is before I think people really knew who I was. This is when people were still trying to figure out, and people are still trying to figure, people have no idea who the frick I am. They think they know, they don't know. But they, you know, collectively, you, regular folks, general population, getting to know me a little bit better, but there was definitely no inclination at this moment. It was like, oh yeah, you're just a parrot. You just sort of, and my video response was like, you think you're scared? All right. This is, you know, Belly, the movie Belly. It's a canonical scene where DMX is talking to the head Don. And the head Don goes, yo, don't bring that scared business to me. You know what I mean? There is that Jamaican still, there's still that part. Don't bring that scared business to me. And the idea is, no, it's not that I'm scared of saying bad stuff about the United States of America. It's that I recognize the myth engine that has created a lifestyle that provides for my family, that provides for my kids, that provides for my wife, that provides for my extended family. I've recognized the narrative that has led me into this university, that has paid me rather well, that has put me in a position of power so that I can give back to the next generation, so that you can go off and do huge things. It's all a consequence of this narrative. Why would I not pledge loyalty to that? Now, that narrative might be subjugating you, and thus you might be motivated to completely usurp and destroy this, and we gonna have a battle. That's what's supposed to happen. It's not that this narrative is pervasive and it's absolutely true. No, it's relatively true, and it's relatively beneficial. It is true to me, and it has benefited me, and I am smart enough and cognitively savvy enough to recognize that one in the same narrative has also probably subjugated you, and it has not benefited you. And thus you might seek to destroy this narrative, and I might seek to destroy your narrative and protect my own and such. But the idea is, no, it's not about just irreverence for the sake of irreverence, right? A lot of liberal sort of academia now is just, you know, anti-US, right? It's a military state, it's a fascist empire, it's a global dictatorship, it's, you know, economic corruption to the hill, you know, it's so bad, everything's horrible, nothing's good. Well, I mean, if that's how you see the world, that's how you see the world. You're going to have a real rough life. It's all sunshine over here. You know, it's all beautiful over here because, you know, I just don't see that. Not to say that I don't feel like I'm slighted, not to feel like I'm not disrespected, not to say that I don't recognize that I'm young, black, and tatted, you know, irrespective of amount of PhDs, that has its own lived consequences, right? I get that. But one in the same narrative still, in terms of interpretationally, in terms of the interpretation of that narrative, it is made me stronger, and many people stronger. So it's identity and loyalty, right? That's the way the narrative is operationalized. Okay, I have two more points. It won't take much time at all, but I don't want to lose any bit of this content, so I'm going to pause the video now, come back and wrap these last two points, 4 and 5, in about 10-15 minutes tops. Okay, so to pick up with number 4. Number 4, quote, Armstrong makes a strong case for grounding the emergence of modern national identities on patterns of ethnic persistence, right? This is important. The mode in which these identities are neither, so the mode in which these identities are neither biological nor geographical, but mythical. It is a recognition that a huge portion of the national identity doesn't pertain to sort of some geographical narrative. It doesn't pertain to, obviously, a biological narrative. Our state is diversified enough where it doesn't pertain to sort of kinship, political. Now, this might be the case in some other nations, right? That you can think of North Korea, obviously. This would be biological. So this interpretation is exclusive in some sense, right? It excludes in some sense. But in terms of how we are to make sense of, how we're to interpret this, we recognize that part of national identification, it transcends biology, it transcends family, it transcends kinship, it transcends ethnicity. Part of our identification with the nation is an identification with the symbol, right? Which is why animals are so important, right? The eagle is a very powerful symbol. And insofar as you see the image of the eagle, it's almost impossible not to at least have the United States of America cross your mind. Especially if it's a photograph. If it's cut in stone or something, you might not think it. But if it's a photograph of a bald eagle, it's almost impossible not to. You ask anybody, what do you think of when you see this? You're going to say United States of America. Of course there's no United States of America in the bald eagle, but what we've done, again, is we've imbued our national identity into that image. And insofar as we've imbued our identity into that image, it's impossible, once you recognize that the two are conjoined, to see the image and for that not to make you think about the United States. You have no control. You will think of the United States of America when you see the bald eagle. So you might look at that as being oppressive, right? You might look at that as sort of with nostalgia. It depends. Interpretational distinctions will differ. But the idea is, it undeniably, beyond your control, will cause a sort of a reaction, and a reaction that was programmed. You were programmed to think United States of America when you see the bald eagle, and it's part of our identity of who we are as Americans, if you will. Now, the interpretation of that might be good or bad, but that's neither here nor there. So for A, Europe's myth is that of the transition to sedentary agriculture, which established a need for military might, which is what I discussed. The Middle East generally established its national identities on the genealogical kinship that determined national affiliation, and I talked about that. So, lastly, number 5, ethnic communities. Ethnosymbolism tracks the changes in the narratives of ethnies in relation to emergencies and transformations in their ethnical identity. Right? The ways in which ethnical identity transforms, right? There was the African American or black identity, let's be specific, the sort of African American identity in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There was the African American identity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And now there is the African American identity in sort of 2000 and beyond. So for me, this is going to be weird when I say this, but it's true. It really is true. When I think African American identity in the 60s, I think MLK. Like 40s, 50s, 60s, I think MLK. When I think 70s, 80s, 90s, believe it or not, I think Will Smith. I think Fresh Prince. Not really Will Smith as a person, but more Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Very symbolic. Very, very symbolic. I don't think people realize how powerfully symbolic Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was as a series, because it was not just black people watching it. I mean, it was Will Smith. He's always been in his prime. I don't think this dude's ever not been in his prime. But I honestly, I think Fresh Prince, I think that sort of captures sort of the Clinton era, if you will. More 90s and such. And now, I don't know, it's yet to be seen. I don't really know. I wouldn't say it's Barack Obama, because I don't want to say transcended race, right? But I wouldn't, when I see President Obama, I don't think sort of representing the black fight, which isn't to disparage him in any sense. I think he himself has said this, right? He's aware of his race, he's aware of his ethnicity, but the idea is he's fighting for America. So I look at him as more sort of a symbol of America than an ethnical symbol. I definitely see MLK as an ethnical symbol. I see Will Smith as an ethnical symbol, the Fresh Prince, not really Will Smith, but I see the Fresh Prince as an ethnical of Bel-Air, not the rapper. Right? It's amazing, right? His identity, not the Fresh Prince, because that was its own thing. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I see that character, Cosby and such, as an ethnical symbol. I don't know what that will be for the 21st century. What I do see is the transition from MLK to Fresh Prince, and this sounds ridiculous. I know. I'm hearing myself say this, but the transition from MLK as a real person to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as a fictional person, I think there's pros and cons, right? I think and even Bill Cosby in terms of Heathcliff Huxtable. I think that's his name, Heathcliff Huxtable, not Bill Cosby, the person, his character on the Cosbys. So those two people, yeah, you see the progress, right? A lot of that dream had been realized in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air's character. A lot of that dream had been realized in Bill Cosby's seminal, probably greatest TV character, top 5 TV characters of all time, Heathcliff Huxtable. You know, you had a doctor married to a lawyer, working class family, upper middle class, great ideals, great moral, great family structure, great image. Same thing with the Fresh Prince. From struggle, living in wealth now, grounded, moral, good hard worker, that really good symbols. The sort of flip side is that they're fictional. So who knows what the next trend would be? Will we go back to MLK and we'll have sort of a rise of a powerful ethnical symbol who sort of assumes religious rights, who assumes civil rights arguments, who assume sort of that old position? Or will it be another installment of a fictional character, which is not to disparage it. I mean, there's huge power in it. Will it be a new sort of black and other races, you know, Hispanic and such? Will it be another installment of a fictional character? And once we get the manifestation of this, then you'll be able to do your pattern analysis. You can't really do your pattern analysis with two points. We need a third. If this becomes fictional, then it's factual, fictional, fictional, maybe factual, or maybe it's factional, fictional, fictional, all the way fiction, all the way down. If it's factual, the individual becomes factual, then it's factual, fictional, factional, fictional. You can imagine how that might proceed and such. Again, it might seem revolutionary. It's really not. I don't have a problem disclosing this because, you know, pattern identification is sort of, it's integral. It's inextricably bound to sort of anything having to do with understanding what nationalism is in the nation. The nation is built on identifying and creating patterns in itself. In terms of our ethnical identification as a people, we as people need to recognize this so that we can aspire to potentially become the next symbol. I mean, it'll be difficult in this age because everybody's on YouTube, including me. Everybody's on YouTube. I'm not doing it for fame, God knows. That's why I make this as boring and arduous as possible. I don't even think we are already in our 20th hour, 20 hour consecutive of me lecturing. So, you know, there'll be a few hundred of you, hopefully no more than that will watch this. I made it arduous and painful for a reason, right? I don't, you know, people can watch sections, but, you know, the person who goes from video 1 to the last video and watches through all of this, shout out to you, because I don't know that I would do it, right? I've created it, I've researched it, I've presented it, but I don't know, you know, I grew up in an old era where you just read books and blah, blah, blah. I don't know if I would have the fortitude and the patience to sit through a 20-hour lecture. I really don't. So if you've made it to this point and you're going to be with me in the last section, which is coming up next, then, you know, shout out to you for sticking through it, because it's methodical, it's dense, it's jargon-filled, and it's supposedly and supposed to be boring as crap. That's the whole idea, right? The idea is to do something different, right? Not to do the sort of Sambo show, the minstrel show. This is not that. This is hardcore, rigorous academia, and it's academia for you, right, for free. So I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.